I'll start by saying that I've never been close with this particular uncle. He's not related to me by blood. He's married to my mom's sister. He's always kind of weirded me out in a sense, because he's usually very drunk and constantly swearing. I don't have anything against swearing, but he does it too much, and it's just very off-putting. He also has a very red face. Now, I don't see the side of my family often, because they live about 5 hours away. A thing like that can put a strain on familiar relationships. So, my mom, my sister, my nephew, and I had driven to see them for Easter weekend when I was around 15 years old. I always have had issues with car sickness and had to take gravel, which has never failed to knock me out. When we got there, I was still pretty out of it and not really awake. I certainly wasn't in a talkative mood, so I went to lie down on the couch. As was and still is my habit, I curled up on the couch, really only taking up one cushion. The gravel was still making me drowsy, but I didn't completely fall asleep. I don't really know how to explain this sort of state, but I wasn't really awake, and I wasn't entirely asleep. Anyway, at one point I felt someone sit down next to me, and I could hear that it was my uncle. He had said something in his unmistakable voice. That made him sound like he was from Newfoundland, even though he's not. I didn't really think much of it. I mean, it was his house, right? He could sit where he wanted. Thinking about it now, though, it was a little odd because the couch had 3 cushions to see 3 people. He made the decision to sit on the middle cushion, closest to me, even though it certainly would have been more comfortable for both of us in terms of space for him to sit on the opposite end of the couch. Then, I felt a hand on my thigh. I wasn't awake enough to do anything about it. Maybe I was too afraid, I don't know, and his hand stayed there for a while. Everyone else was sitting outside on the deck, and it was only he and I that were in the living room. So naturally, no one else saw this. I'm not quite sure how long this lasted. When I was fully awake, he was gone. I told my mom, and she was instantly furious and wanted to tell my aunt, but I was afraid, and I didn't want her to. I was worried that maybe in my only semi-conscious state, I had made a mistake. Had I imagined it? I knew I hadn't yet. Part of me wanted to think that I had. My mom convinced me it would be okay if she told my aunt so. I let her. Now, this came at a time when my uncle had started drinking more heavily, and as it happened, he'd been rather drunk when we had arrived. Thus, my aunt made the decision not even to mention it to him. She figured he was probably too drunk to realize he'd even done it. The rest of the weekend, I was totally uneasy. I had nightmares of my uncle sneaking into the room. I was staying in, but fortunately that never happened. Because of this incident, I've been hesitant to visit my aunt and my cousins at all because I don't want to encounter him, and I don't want to stay in the same house as him. He creeps me out, and I think I'm legitimately scared of him. My mom and sister managed to convince me to go with them to visit for Thanksgiving. I stayed at my cousin's house while we were there and avoided contact with this uncle as best I could. I constantly wonder and worry if he's done this to either of my cousin's daughters. Also, and I don't know if this adds to this at all, but it says something to me. My nephew, who at the time of the Easter incident was just a few months old, was terrified of him. When we visited during Thanksgiving, he would have just been under 2 years old by then and still didn't care for the man. When I was about 6 years old, Easter was rolling around, and I really wanted a chocolate bunny. I asked my dad to take me to Rite Aid to get me one, and he said he was too busy, so I told him I would just walk. And he said that was fine, because honestly, he was a pretty crappy parent. So I embark on the 1.5 or 2-mile walk through rural Louisiana to the store. Houses are pretty sparse. I come up to a 4-way intersection, and I can see the store in the distance. As I approach the 4-way, I see a small green truck, which I think was a Ford Ranger. There are 2 men in it, and the one in the passenger seat is blatantly pointing at me repeatedly, and they're both looking at me. I was about to cross through a parking lot on the right side of this intersection when I see this truck, whip into it, and park between 2 other cars. Then, I see the passenger jump out of the truck and crouch down with his hands out, trying to hide between their truck and a vehicle that they had parked next to. Thankfully, an older woman that used to babysit me when I stayed with my mom filled my young head with a bunch of stranger danger propaganda, so I immediately flipped out, bypassed the parking lot, and broke out into a dead sprint into the Rite Aid. Once inside, I began to pace around the store a little bit to try to calm down. I took a glance through the glass front door, and I see this truck with the two guys in it parked right in front of the Rite Aid. At this point, I knew beyond all doubt what was going on, and I asked the old lady at the cash register if I could use the store's phone to call my dad, and she said the phone could only be used to call 1-800 numbers for some reason. I burst into tears and started to get hysterical, and the manager came up to the front and let me use his cell phone. I got in touch with my dad, who sent my brothers to pick me up, and by the time they got there, the green truck had left. The worst part of all this, no one believed me. Everyone in my family just nonchalantly said, "So, what happened? Something about a kidnapping." And I told them what had happened, and everyone brushed it off. It was never spoken about again. Makes me furious to this day. I wonder what those scumbags were planning. And the thing that troubles me the most is that they could have gotten some other kid that day and done God knows what. When I was around 10, my parents belonged to a local bowling team, and sometimes they take my siblings and I along to the bowling alley to go and watch. This particular night happened to be the night before Easter. My younger brother and I decided to grab a bowling ball and sit in the carpeted walkway and just roll it back and forth because we were bored. While we were doing that, a man approached and started talking to us. He seemed nice at first, just asking simple questions like, "How are you doing?" and "Are you excited for the Easter Bunny and you going to get lots of candy?" I didn't think anything of it, so I just politely answered his questions. Then, out of the blue, the sky whispers to me, "I know where you live. I'm like the Easter Bunny, but instead of candy, I'm going to come into your house and kill you and your family." He then rambled on, basically repeating that over and over and over, and stuff about it being our last night to live. I just remember looking at the man speechless and getting up, grabbing my brother, and going to find my parents. I didn't tell him what he said, and in hindsight, I definitely should have. I was terrified all of Easter that year because I was so scared that this man was actually going to come to our house and kill us. So, creepy man in the bowling alley. So I've never been a big believer of ghosts, or maybe it was just a fear of believing. But in the recent months, I've been changing my way of living, my faith, my beliefs, my fears, etc., since I've become more open-minded. Something unexplainable happened twice in the past week. I've been living at my apartment since August in downtown Suffolk. There are old buildings that were renovated. I've never had any paranormal experiences here before. I have 4 children, and they have never been scared or had anything unusual happen. On Easter night, I woke up a few times during the night, and while I lay there, dozing back off, I hear jelly beans dropping, bouncing, rolling around on the dining room table where all the kids' Easter baskets are. I only have a 2-bedroom apartment. My son has his own room, and my daughters all share a room. And I set up my own room as sort of a loft or studio apartment, sharing it with the living room, kitchen, and dining room. So I look up to see if the kids are getting into their baskets, but I don't see any of them. So I go check on them in their rooms, but they're all sound asleep. While this is going on, the candies have stopped jumping around and playing. I go back to bed, brushing it off. I wake up another time, and I can hear the candy again, bouncing and rolling around. Then nothing. And no candy has come out of the baskets. No candy is on the floor or on the table, so I just assume we have a mouse. Fast forward to just a few moments ago. I woke up at like 5:15 and began dozing off again, and here comes the bouncing, rolling candy noise again. So I look over at the table, nothing. I sit up, no candy noise. I cut on all the lights and I flipped the house upside down looking for candy, any round candy anywhere. Specifically on or around the table, nothing. I even clean up stray candy wrappers from the floor, but there's no candy anywhere, only in the baskets where it belongs. I look for rodents. I listen. Nothing. I turn my back, walk back to my bed and sit in it, and then I look over at the table, and there's candy on the floor in front of the dining table with bites taken out of them. I am not kidding. I could never tell my kids because it would terrify them, so here I am sharing it all on the internet. Needless to say, I'm a believer. I am a very strong believer. But with my recent self-changes, I'm not as terrified as I would have been before. I've told people about Easter night, but everyone brushed it off like there was some simple explanation. I don't really know what happened, but needless to say, I didn't tell my kids, and we had a wonderful Easter anyway. This past Easter, my dad, a pilot for a cargo shipping company, was in town and offered to take me across the inlet for a nice dinner. As his co-pilots were always away from their families, they were also invited to join, and gladly they did. While I waited for them to validate their tickets at the ferry terminal, I spotted an unlikely duo standing by the door. Two guys, late 20s at most, one large and oafish and the other shorter and movie star gorgeous. I looked just in time to see Oaf nod in my direction and movie star make a face that can only be described as, I'd screw her after a few beers. They stood close to us in the terminal, and keep in mind this ferry carries hundreds of people at a time, and I told my dad about the nod. He laughed and continued talking to his co-pilots next to us. Every time I looked over, movie star was already looking at me. I shook my head. We sat on opposite ends of the ferry, Oath and movie star debarking before us. I was glad they were gone. We walked up the street from the terminal to the restaurant, and when I turned back to take in the view of the city across the water, was I surprised to find that duo had somehow ended up behind us, and were slowly walking up the street. I didn't think too much on it. It was a busy area, and lots of pubs were around. I did think more about it when they walked by the restaurant, peering intently into the front window where we were standing waiting for a table. They smiled, exchanged words with each other, and kept moving. I let out a sigh of relief, until they walked back by from the opposite direction. They stopped, leaned on a bike rack in front of the restaurant for a few minutes, and then left. Movie star was staring over his shoulder the whole time. Over dinner, I informed my dad and his co-pilots of the events that had transpired without them even realizing it. They laughed about it, and eventually they even had me laughing about it too. We had never seen the pair of guys again, but 3 hours later, as we waited for the return ferry, I was talking to our company, recounting a story from earlier dinner when I spotted Oaf and movie star over my dad's shoulder. Movie star was looking my way. Scratch that, staring my way. I quickly informed the guys. They were shocked and kept looking back at the pair. There was a miniature showdown in the ferry terminal as each party stared each other down from opposite ends. Long story short, I ended up getting a 3-man escort home that night.